So let's talk about Nexperia seizure and how even the US is panicking over it. Now the situation is so dire that Trump himself is stepping in to prevent an implosion. And let's do a recap. The Netherlands seized control of Nexperia, which is a major Chinese-owned chip producer. Now they produce legacy chips used in electronics and cars. They make nearly 100 billion chips annually. So you can understand how important this supply is, not just to China, but a global manufacturing economy as well. And the whole situation has escalated within just a couple of months. Wingtech, which is a Chinese company, bought Nexperia in 2019. But it was in 2025 under the Trump regime where things really hit the fan. Now, because of US restrictions and influence, the Dutch decided to seize control of Nexperia. China then retaliated and they started to restrict exports of Nexperia chips to the world. And now we have a cascading effect throughout global supply chains. Companies like Volkswagen in Germany are halting production as a result of the chip crunch. Most of the conversation today revolves around high-tech AI chips, but legacy chips today controls global industries. And guess how much of the global supply chain Nexperia controls? An incredible 25% of the world's total market. The majority of Nexperia chips ends up in the auto sector. So no Chinese chips means no cars on the streets. Even Honda is cutting production at some of their North American plants. That's how serious things are becoming. Honda has halved their production at its Canadian plant. At its Mexican plant, they have downright halted production there. And the models affected are the best sellers like the classic Honda Civic. The domino effect is starting to build, and Trump's favorite sector is starting to crumble. Now, companies build cars in the US to escape the tariffs. However, if chips to the US stopped because of the Nexperia seizure, then what's the point of reshoring your factory? According to a US lobby group, US auto plants are 2 to 4 weeks away from major impacts on production. In other words, massive auto plant shutdowns. We could see an exodus of companies out of the US and G7 countries. The supply shock is about to get worse. Nexperia, under Dutch control, is going to cut wafer supplies to their Chinese assembly plant all the way in Guangdong province. Now, this is crazy. 70% of EU produced chips are finished and packaged in China, and then it gets shipped out to distributors around the world. If you stop sending chips from the Netherlands to China, global automakers are the first to suffer. So, this whole situation is really silly. Now, just think about it. China will protect their own supply and prioritize their own auto giants first, won't they? The legacy chips will get to BYD, it will get to NIO before GM, Ford, or Honda in the US. It's just common sense. The entire auto industry is already getting squeezed by Chinese competition. Now, Volkswagen, they book an operating loss of 1.3 billion euros in 2025. But an Xperia cutoff could make things exponentially worse. And that's why the US themselves, they are taking action. Washington is begging China to U-turn their curbs. And as part of the trade deal, the US wants China to resume Nexperia chip shipments. But that will only happen if Nexperia themselves resumes chip supply to their Chinese factories. It's a crazy chain of events. Under US influence, Nexperia was seized, and now under US influence, Nexperia has to be back in business. It's a classic case of sanctions and seizures backfiring. Global industries today are just too connected. Without their legacy chips, one of two things would happen. Automakers would need to uproot their factories and get closer to the source of all the semiconductors, and that would be China. The only thing worse than US tariffs is not even being able to produce the cars. Zero production means zero revenue and guaranteed losses. The US might dominate AI chip production today, but legacy chips are a whole different story. China's advantage here is only going to grow stronger. The entire supply chain here is at its strongest. By 2027, China will account for 39% of global legacy chips. 4 out of every 10 legacy chips will be Chinese made. And because they are made in China, they will be significantly cheaper than other competitors in the US or EU. Over half of global expansion is also being done by the Chinese, so dominance in this sector is sealed at least for the next decade. And this gives China incredible bargaining power. Everyone, especially automakers, they all know this. And that's why Washington is trying to get the flow of chips going again. If not, the second outcome will be even more likely. Chinese vehicle production is not going to stop, especially if they have first dips on legacy chips. Now, you throw in AI tech advancements and cheaper costs, it's a wrap for G7 automakers. Chinese cars are already flooding EU markets like never before. The growth is simply insane. Despite the tariffs, Chinese auto exports to Europe has captured 7.4% of all car sales, and this includes battery EVs and hybrids. Hybrid growth is above 15%, while EV growth is above 11%. EU cars are so uncompetitive that even the tariffs aren't an effective barrier to Chinese exports. So imagine the consequences of a full chip shutdown from next period. More EU factories will close, while more Chinese exports will flood the market. It's basically self defeating. The Dutch seizure basically screwed G7 auto giants, including the US. But let's talk a bit about inflation today and the asset bubble that's still growing. Now, over the past week, we covered the incredible AI bubble that's growing exponentially. A lot of money is flowing into the United States. Yesterday, we also talked about how the Fed rate cuts and balance sheet pivot confirms the unthinkable. Money printing is back on schedule. US M2 money supply rose by a stunning 4.5% in September this year. We are now at a record $22.2 trillion. Despite the tariff war and global trade slowing down, the supply of dollars just continues to grow. The slight move down in 22 and 23 is over. We are back into the expansion zone in the US money supply. In simple terms, more dollars are flooding in the economy and the entire financial system. This is disturbing because it confirms inflation is still a crisis that will not go away. The threat of higher asset prices isn't over yet, especially when interest rates are going to drop further down. Long term, you have to own assets or you'll be left behind. Now, why is this happening? Because tariff revenue is being recycled back into the US government to use. Scott Bessent is also borrowing a ton of money from the world for deficit spending. The Fed halting their balance sheet reduction is also a signal to the world that the trillions printed will be left in the system. The Fed is not going to take away the punch bowl. The additional $4 trillion printed will stay sloshing in the US. Obviously, this is a tailwind for every asset class. This includes stocks, gold, and even Bitcoin. Wall Street is also going to use these falling rates to leverage up their positions, which is something that we have warned about. The US casinos open once again, everyone is pumping money into risky assets. And that's why we have to sound the alarm bell here. Because when everyone is bullish to the moon, it's really time to raise your hands and get defensive, guys. Now, despite the tariff war, the Nasdaq is on a winning streak, the longest since 2017. Every company in the US is hyping AI to the moon. All the earnings calls are littered with executives throwing in the words artificial intelligence at every corner. Now, yes, it's hilarious, yes, it's funny, but at the same time, it's a systemic problem that we shouldn't ignore. Growth stocks in the US trades at such a crazy premium that everything has to go right. The stars they must all align or collapse could come out of nowhere. US bank reserves have fallen to just $2.8 trillion, the lowest level since 2020. Banks are moving their money out, and this has the hallmarks of a liquidity crisis. Remember what is propping up all the AI money for these data centers? They are loans from the banks, and should defaults happen from the bubble popping, then we'll see another bailout happen. The Fed's real mandate isn't just to keep employment high and inflation low, it's to ensure the entire system doesn't melt down. However, that would mean money printing at an epic scale. So the red flags should be mighty obvious. But let's talk about our final story today. The G7 is now moving to make a desperate and dangerous gambit against Chinese supply chains. Finally, the West realizes they are decades behind in the raw materials and critical minerals game. They are coming together in a desperate bid to dethrone China, to create a weird form of Western mineral alliance. Now, the G7 is going to announce a critical minerals production alliance to counter China's dominance in the sector. Now, one can imagine how expensive that is going to be. Trillions of dollars is needed to even make it feasible. The West realizes how China can play them using supply and demand dynamics. Beijing can impose export controls and crush Western industries. The auto sector and semiconductor industry are always at risk. China can also flood the market with excess supply to crush competitor margins. Suddenly, your profits can go underwater and you'll be operating at a big loss. So, how do you attempt to break Chinese dominance? Well, you have to spend an impossible amount of money to even stand a chance. Now, there's a saying about invading a castle. You typically need 3 times the amount of troops, but for Chinese supply chains, you probably need 10 times or more. China's ecosystem is a big force multiplier. They have very steep castle walls. Now, the G7 alliance will involve offtake agreements to guarantee supply and the mine's survival. So, a mine that is not making money in the real world could still sell maybe 70% of their production to the G7. This crazy plan will also feature price floors and stockpiling deals. The plan is to build Western supply chains at all costs and build up the reserves of critical minerals. But I think you can see the big flaw in this plan already. How much money will be spent on this adventure? Now, building a whole different supply chain for the West will require consistent subsidies no matter what. The problem is that the West is broke. The only way to finance this is through debt and deficits. And even if that's the case, it will just cause big dislocations and could fall apart under its own weight. Now, price floors will eventually reduce the quantities that buyers wish to order. Why pay 50% more when I can go to the open market, the global market, to get it for far less? And which industry will want to be less competitive? Secondly, sellers would most definitely want to sell more. So the G7 governments will need to keep spending up like no tomorrow. The winners will be the few selected producers. So now capital gets moved away from productive parts of the economy to less productive parts. Now inflation gets dialed up in the G7 countries. And we can expect China to turn up the heat during this process as well. And here's the funny part, at the same time, G7 countries like Canada are trying to rebuild relations with China for the consumers. Now, remember the joke we made about Carney drinking tea in Beijing? Well, Carney is really going to be having tea in China. He has accepted President Xi's invitation to visit. Canada needs to revive their exports to Chinese companies. It really shows how the West is trapped here. US tariffs are crushing them, so they need to sell into big markets like China. However, they have lost control of their supply chains, so they are banding together to form this weird mineral alliance. It's not a slam dunk. What's guaranteed is the West spending a ton of money and racking up a huge amount of debt in the process. But let me know what you think. Will the next period seizure get U-turn? And will the G7 Mineral Alliance even work today? Let me know in the comments below. Stay safe. Be sure to smash the like button and subscribe as we navigate through these crazy times.